Unlike pretty much the entire rest of the cast, Asuka has no adjustments to his total effective health, so he's just as tanky and squishy as he was in the previous patch in this version of the game. Considering that many characters have had their normal attacks increase in terms of damage or various special moves of theirs, Asuka should be taking a little more damage in this patch than he did in the previous patch in those matchups. Like many other characters, Asuka's 6p has increased recovery now, so let's take a look at them side by side. It's fairly noticeable to me, but again, this falls in line with pretty much every other above average 6p that's been in the game. So Asuka won't really feel the impact of this nerf relatively more than the rest of the cast, but it does mean that it's going to be much easier to punish on whiff now. Asuka's Overdrive high compression submicron particle sphere has a couple of changes to it, so let's go ahead and look at the behaviors on hit and on block in the previous patch that compare them to the current version. Since there are two versions of this super that have different behaviors, we'll also have to look at each of them side by side. So let's go ahead and start with what the punch version looked like in mid-screen on block. There's quite a bit of pushback to this version of the move, so the enemy was outside of Asuka's far/slash range. The kick version pushed them even farther out. Let's list the specific changes to the super and then break down the difference in gameplay behavior. So, they've decreased the interval between hits, so the super should last a little less time. They've increased the recovery on it, as well as decreased the hit stop and decreased the speed of its backward movement. All in all, this means that the super is going to be different in some situations and definitively worse in others. Let's talk about the new situation on block. Before, the enemy was pushed out too far away for there to be any real interaction, which for a zoner like Asuka was favorable because it meant that he would buy himself space to potentially throw out another spell, regenerate a little bit of mana, disengage even further. It's something that a zoner likes to have. Now, we're within range for there to be interactions between the two players. As you can see, my far/slash will actually reach the opponent now, as will the enemy's Asuka. We are still plus in this situation, however, which is nice, but there is some RPS to be played. For a very simple demonstration of this, I have the enemy Asuka set to 6p. If we go for a far/slash trying to take advantage of our plus frames, the enemy could just 6p and beat us out cleanly right there. So, because of these closer ranges, some characters might have some more advantageous options to threaten Asuka with, so this is less of a strong get-off-me tool. The kick version, however, does maintain some decent pushback to it. So we are able to push the enemy outside of normal button ranges. We'll see if Asuka start to favor using this super overall. Now let's take a look at this version of the super on hit. As you can see, you can pick up juggles with this super, and this applied to both the punch version and the kick version. Most Asuka players, to my understanding, would pick the punch version of the super because it fired the cube that could interact with any of the gravity-altering filters that Asuka could summon. The situation on hit for Asuka, however, is dramatically worse. I'm not even able to move to run up and pick up a combo on the opponent with the punch version anymore. And the same is true for the kick version. So this definitely removes a lot of the combo utility that this super had previously, pretty much relegating it to being just a wall break option for Asuka, which makes sense. Your best chances to pick up combos with this super now, or rather to even just use it in the middle of combos, is to have some kind of gravity filter out on the field. And even then, you're going to be limited by the placement and what gravity filter that you're able to pull at the time. It's certainly going to take a little more brain power to make this particular super work in combos, which I think is fine in a way, but it's probably an indication that this patch is not going to be the kindest to Asuka. Bookmark Full Order has a couple of changes as well, so let's go ahead and take a look at how it used to behave. You could select all of your spells, and slowly over time, Asuka would drain just a little bit of his mana. Now let's take a look at how Bookmark Full Order behaves in the current patch. As you might be able to tell, they've noticeably increased the overall effect duration while also increasing the mana cost of it. However, you are also now able to swap test cases out. This provides a lot of cool new utility for the super that if players are willing to dive into, they could jump across all their test cases, try and fish for some of the best spells from them, and build up an entirely new hand because of that one. It might be a bit too big-brained for its own good to actually see some really crazy competitive stuff, because we are talking about pulling random spells from 3 different cases, but the extra utility is nice. The increased mana depletion is certainly going to be something that some would consider a bit of a nerf, and it's going to be very important for Asuka players to end the effect of the super very quickly. Now let's start looking into some of the specific bookmarks that Asuka has had changed. First up is Recover Mana Continuous. I have Asuka here set to have his mana at about 10, which is close to the lowest possible mana that you need in order to cast the bookmark in the first place. The effect would slowly regenerate mana over time, and would almost heal you up back to full mana. This is pretty good output for him. However, as you regenerated this mana, if there was any kind of hit stop on screen, the mana regeneration would freeze. So this would artificially slow it down. But as you can see, the overall mana regenerated did not decrease whatsoever. Now, however, if you were put into hits done by the opponent, so you're getting comboed, or you were blocking the opponent's pressure, the mana regen would still continue to tick. Now, obviously, while you would have your overall mana decrease from it, the mana regeneration could potentially save you from going into out-of-mana state. Let's look at the current behaviors of this now. For starters, they've reduced the overall effect duration, but increased the mana recovery rate. So you generate the same amount of mana at a faster bit of time. This seems like a nice buff on the surface, but there's some other changes to talk about as well. When you put the opponent into hit stun, the mana regeneration no longer pauses. Honestly, I think this is a nice buff because it basically means that you're not going to be freezing your mana count. So as you combo the opponent, you're able to generate a little bit more mana that it could afford you the ability to cast other spells. I think, again, this is a nice buff. However, now is time to talk about a very crucial nerf to this bookmark. If Asuka is blocking the opponent or getting hit by them, the mana regeneration stops completely. Not only that, the effect duration itself doesn't get extended at all. As you can see, we didn't regenerate nearly the same amount of mana that we did before because we were put into block stun. This spell was massive for keeping Asuka in the game and preventing him from going into his out of mana state. But now, if he gets tagged by this at low mana, it's not going to save him. And again, after the effect duration and once he buys himself some space, he has less mana overall to work with. The other changes to it were pretty nice, but this is a huge nerf to this spell overall. They've also made some nerfs to recover mana instant. Previously, you would discard your entire bookmarks in order to power up your mana regeneration. You can go from pretty low to full mana with all of your spells intact. And if you only had a single spell, you still regenerate quite a bit of mana. Even with no spells, it was a hefty amount. Now, instant mana regen no longer consumes any bookmarks in order to power up its mana consumption, and instead regenerates a standardized amount of mana. However, it's pretty laughably low. So we can pretty much see that Asuka's ability to regenerate his mana through spells has largely been gutted, at least from his 2 most effective sources. Let's go ahead and look at some other changes to his spells as we go down the list now. Bookmark Random Import has a small little buff to it, actually. Previously, in order for you to use the spell effectively, you had to have your bookmark slotted in order to shuffle up those spells. If you didn't have those spells bookmarked, then you wouldn't be able to get new spells in their spots. Now, if you use this particular spell and you don't have some spells bookmarked, you'll get new bookmarked imports anyway, which is a nice buff for Asuka, giving him better access to cycling through his spells from another source. Low pass filter gravity has decreased the altitude limit for an air dash while the effect is active. Previously, it didn't really have too much of an effect on it. As you can see, Asuka, even with this filter in place, could still cross up the opponent. Here's the behavior in the current patch. You're able to stay pretty much closer to the ground, allowing Asuka to do some same-side plays. With a slight delay, you can still get some cross-ups as well. So there's a little more control here that might take some time to explore with. Delayed Tardus Metron now has a stronger reaction to the high-pass filter gravity effect. Previously, it would bounce up and down like this, controlling a little less space overall, but it would be pretty useful for locking down a certain part of the screen. Now, if we use these two spells together, you get increased range. I would argue that this is arguably a buff, because once it gets close enough to the opponent to have its 3 hits detonate on them, there's really not much else to do with the spell, and it's not going to travel further or anything like that. So having overall more effective range for this particular combo is a bit nice for neutral, I'd say. Like all other invincible DPs in the game, Asuka's Aquila Metron DP can no longer be cancelled into overdrive during the startup. Again, this is just to make sure that you can't go for a DP and then cancel it into an overdrive very early to then have iframes into more iframes and then cancel that with an RC to stay safe. Just making sure that all the invincible DPs have no way to get out of, committing to the reversal. Shift Metron has a couple of changes to it. Previously, there was 2 versions of the spell, one that started level 5 and the other that started level 1. Both versions would then tick up or down depending on their starting level to then either add or subtract the projectiles that it would fire. This meant that if Asuka pulled a random 5, he'd have quick access to a huge screen-covering multi-projectile move. If he had access to the lower one, he had to buy time in order to use it. It was also at relatively cheap mana cost. Specifically, it was at a mana cost of 12. I have to demonstrate this next change a little bit tediously because you might be confused by some training mode text. If you look under character-specific settings and look at spells, you'll see that you have access to Shift Metron starting from level 1 and starting from level 5. However, in an actual match scenario, Asuka cannot pull the Shift Metron spell that starts at level 5 from his test case 3 anymore. Instead, he pulls 2 level 1s. There's the first one we pulled. Danger. And there's a second one we pulled. As you see, they both start at level 1. The reason for still having the option to select a level 5 in training mode is to ensure that if you want to start with immediate level 5, you don't have to wait this couple of seconds in order to get the level 5. You can just start with it and start labbing away with whatever you want to do with it. But, as you might have noticed while I was talking about that, they did decrease the amount of time it takes for a level to increase. It takes about 2 seconds for it to go up a single level. So within 10 seconds time, you should have access to your level 5 Shift Metron. However, they've also increased the mana cost of the spell. At 15 mana, Asuka can't cast this. But at 16, he can. So it costs 16 mana exactly now, up from 12. RMS Boost Metron has decreased damage at level 1 and level 2. Level 1 did 41 damage. While level 2 did 49 damage. Here's the new damage. Level 1 now does 37 damage. And level 2 does 45 damage. Pretty marginal decreases overall. To offset this, or rather to rebalance the spell, they've increased the damages at level 3, 4, and 5. So let's take a look at those now. The old patch did 57 damage at level 3. 66 damage at level 4. And 74 damage at level 5. Now for the new damage. Level 3 does 60 damage. Level 4 goes up to 82 damage. And level 5 does 112 damage, a pretty monumental increase for the move, actually. What this effectively means is that they've nerfed the early game power of this spell while buffing its late game power overall, making it more advantageous for you to draw this towards the end of your test case, as opposed to starting out with it. They made one last change to its properties, and that's to the Guard Crush. Previously, the Guard Crush was a pretty flat rate all the way around, regardless of the level of spell, with tons of advantage. That was level 1. And that's level 5. Tons of advantage to work with, which is favorable for Asuka to run more offense, generate mana, or cycle through some spells. Now, the Guard Crush has been significantly reduced for early versions of the spell. Asuka is only slightly plus with a level 1 of. However, the Guard Crush will now scale based on the number of the spell. At level 5, it's almost comparable to what it was at a flat rate before, with every version below 5 being worse in terms of its frame advantage. Again, this is a bit of a huge nerf for Asuka, because instead of this spell being a reliable Guard Crush for them to use in pressure to then go ahead and do some resource management, now not only are there variables that they have to keep track of to get used to each specific Guard Crush duration for all of these variations of the spell, but it's not as reliable as it was before unless you have a maxed out version of the spell. Again, another pretty substantial nerf to Asuka, I would argue. Asuka has caught more than a couple of stray bullets when it comes to this particular patch for him. The character has been steadily nerfed over time now, receiving expanded hitboxes for his spells so that they're easier to check with things as simple as a 5p, and now they've targeted his survivability in this patch by reducing the effectiveness of some of his most important recover mana spells. So now Asuka players are more reliant on managing their mana themselves, and this also reduces the effectiveness of those test cases that provided those recover mana spells in the first place. He's lost some of his combo potential as well as safety netted to him from his high compression submicron particle sphere. That's a mouthful and a half, but it should still see some use, albeit less often, as I think it's largely going to be relegated for some of his gravity filter shenanigans, or specifically to break the wall, as opposed to adding in a whole bunch of damage at the start of some combos and then extending them even further, or as an alternative to extending combos when he's in a low mana situation. In addition to that, he's lost access to some of his most potent spells, namely the Shift Metron version level 5. Having to consistently wait for that spell definitely is a nerf to his overall zoning, as he has to wait the 10 seconds to get access to that powerful spell. And the Guard Crush loss, or rather the reduction of it, from RMS Boost Metron is also something that's going to impact the character's ability to consistently pressure with the test cases that use those. The buffs to Bookmark Full Order as well as to Bookmark Random Import are pretty well appreciated, I would say, but I also know that just for looking at a character who was fairly difficult to play and still is to this day, to receive so many nerfs while some other characters of this similar archetype, design, and power level didn't nearly get as many nerfs as they arguably deserve to, at least in some of the player base's eyes. If I remember correctly, when the patch first dropped, Zondo, one of the most notable and best Asuka players out there, said he was pretty much done with the character, and I also don't blame him because if memory serves, Zondo's played Ramlethal in the past, and her stocks have just gone way, way up this patch as it is. So I can understand making the shift from one top tier who got nerfed to another top tier who only got buffs, namely. So I can see that one. We'll see how Asuka players get along in this patch. I think he's still functionally fine and still has a lot of great things going on for him, but I can understand the frustration of playing a character in a patch where most of the cast has received new toys to play with or some new tools. He's getting shot, and that kind of sucks.